Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Clarissa Morosky with the Reloop platform, and today we're going to talk about some elements of the international legally binding instrument on plastics pollution. I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Dominic Hogg, who has been working with Reloop since before INC2, so that we can have an informed voice within the total INC process. Reloop is an accredited NGO under UNEP.
Hi, Clarissa. It's great to be here.
We've talked about funding through EPR, where producers have to pay for the proper management of what they put on the market today and tomorrow and in the future. But there's also historical waste or legacy waste. There's a lot of funding needed just to start to really build these systems up. You have emphasized the importance of leveraging global levies on primary plastics production as a potential funding source. Could you explain in more detail how such a global levy would work, its potential benefits, and any challenges associated with its implementation?
Yeah, I think there are some subtleties here. So first of all, I think there's a tension in the zero draft. The contact groups, just as they did in Paris, in Nairobi, will be discussing, one contact group will be discussing part 2, these control measures, and another contact group will be discussing financing. And for me, there are lots of places where the two are inextricably linked. So we've just been talking about EPR. Well, it's a really good example where the financing of what you've got to do is hopefully going to come as a consequence of the measure that you're implementing. The reverse is true also, though, because in the financing section in the instrument, they discuss a global fee for plastic pollution. It's not clear how that would be set yet, but that has its mirror in part 2, where there's a discussion about targets for reducing primary plastic production. So logically, if you'd say, well, hang on a minute, you've got a target over here for reducing global plastic production. You're talking about a levy over here. In some way, the levy would be expected to have an effect at the margin on production and consumption. So why don't you make an explicit link between the two? That might not mean that you use a levy. So if you decided, for example, that having taken into account the effect of all the other control measures, that you still felt there was something to be said for setting a target for reducing further plastic production, then design a measure to do that. And if you think you can design a measure called a global plastic pollution fee, maybe you could also think about designing a global system for tradable allowances. So you, instead of taxing people, if you had a clear idea of the sort of production target you wanted to meet, you'd set in place effectively a cap and trade system. And you'd say to all the plastic producers, you'd say, okay, for every ton of plastic polymer you put on the market, you need to purchase one allowance representing a ton of plastic production. And of course, what you do is you gradually tighten the cap. There'll be a price for those plastic production allowances, if you like. And depending on the level of demand vis-a-vis that cap, the price would go up or down accordingly. And in the same way as you had a fee, you would generate revenue.
Stop right there, Dominic. I want to talk about this cap and trade. It's quite a controversial topic amongst the environmental organizations, or many, because of the perceived fear, or maybe real fear, that it's just sort of a license to pollute. It's a license to continue business as usual. So what I understand from what you're saying is the key is in ratcheting it down and making sure that that price of those tradable allowances are very much sort of pushing for those reduction efforts.
Okay, so perhaps there are some people who think that this might look like a license to pollute, and that they're concerned about that. Well, the question I would put to them is, are you as concerned or less concerned or more concerned at the discussion around a levy on plastic production that's already in the instrument or being proposed in the instrument. Now, the reason I ask is that there's no reason at all why you can't design this instrument as a hybrid, where you basically say, right, we're going to set our target level of reduction and our cap will reflect that. But we then set a floor price for the allowances. So under no condition does the allowance price fall below a certain agreed level, which might, for example, reflect a notional understanding of the externalities of producing plastic, difficult as though that will be to articulate globally, I can assure you. And so I think that type of approach where you said we're going to have a hybrid system here where we set a floor price for the allowances, but we also set a cap on production. It means that everyone's always going to have an incentive to be reducing production and consumption consistent with the levy, but actually they might have a greater incentive if the cap implies a traded price for those allowances that's above the floor price that's indicated by that fee. So the interesting thing about that approach is you end up still generating the revenue that you might want to use to fund what some people call legacy plastic pollution. I think there's going to be a problem defining legacy plastic pollution. I would almost tend to say, look at all the forms of the ways in which plastic pollution goes into rivers, seas, whatever. Look then at waste management and the stuff that you can get funded by EPR and call everything else whatever you want to call it, but it's the stuff that gets funded by stuff other than the fees from the producers that comes through extended producer responsibility. It's logical, isn't it? We don't have to give it a fancy name. If we want to call it legacy, let's call it legacy. But it's not just legacy. It's stuff that's going to be ongoing whilst this is all happening. And so it's not strictly legacy. We've got to fund the implementation of what we're going to do. So why not articulate this in terms of, well, which funds need to fund what activity? And that, I think, is a crucial thing that the instrument needs to do, and it's not going to do, or it seems less likely to do, as long as one contact group is discussing control measures and another contact group is discussing financing over here. They've got to be talking to each other all the time and saying, right, okay, we're talking about this measure here for what we're calling legacy pollution. Maybe we should call it pollution beyond waste management. So we need some money for that. We don't need necessarily a load of money to fund waste management because we ought to be able to do that from producers, other things being equal. So let's start to link the sources of the revenue to the activities that we've got to fund in order to implement the instrument in its final form.
So Dominic, this sounds perfect, but it sounds huge. And broadly speaking, how would something like this be implemented? If the treaty did come out and it had proper extended producer responsibility obligation for all the producers in the whole wide world, and it also had some funding mechanisms driven by levies for primary production in is it a general fund, a UN fund? What could it look like? And who makes the decisions on who gets the money and how much?
Instinctively, funding through EPR is collected anyway by the parties. So the good thing about that is you don't need funds that are presumably going to be distributed by some entity. You don't need that entity to get involved in that distribution. What is going to be required and where there's a role for distribution, if you like, is taking the money from whether it be the global plastic pollution fee or whether it be from some hybrid system of tradable allowances and fees that I've described. That will need to be dispersed. And there are some key things that it's going to have to fund. The first of those, and I think the most important thing, because I genuinely believe that not much will happen unless this gets properly funded, is that you need to fund the capacity building of all the countries whose capacity at the moment is limited to do this. And you're going to have to fund that to quite a considerable degree. My guess is it's in the order of billions every year for the staff. And that's because if you're going to do anything at all on waste management for these 2.8 billion people who don't have anything at the moment, that isn't a case of just getting people in place in some national ministry. They're not going to be the ones who set up the service. They really, well, they might be in some very small island states, perhaps. But in the main, that's going to get done, for example, by local government officials. And so there's got to be some way of cascading the responsibilities down, got to be some way of cascading or providing the means of implementation down. But fundamentally, you're going to have the expertise on the ground to change things on the ground, not just sit around on your hands in the ministry and saying, oh, look, I wrote this into law. It should happen, shouldn't it? Because I can tell you it won't. And I've seen that too many times in my life. I've seen lawyers sitting in government ministries scratching their heads saying, oh, why isn't this happening? We've changed the law. And that is what we call the implementation gap. People have to make sure that the means are there all the way through the chain to make things happen and change them on the ground. As well as that, we're going to need to fund outside of the funds from extended producer responsibility. We're going to need to fund that non-waste management source of plastic pollution. And there may be, for example, old landfills that are right by the sea, who, for reasons to do with, amongst other things, climate change, may see the tipping face being eroded year on year. And so you're revealing this pile of stuff that was deposited in past years. We have exactly that problem here in the United Kingdom. As a consequence of the erosion of the seawall and sea level rise, we see old landfills that have accepted all types of stuff over years and years that are being exposed to the sea and just washing stuff in there. That's a problem. We need to sort that out. The other one that I think will be controversial in the context of this instrument, but which is nonetheless worth considering, is the non-plastic bit of managing waste.
Waste isn't just plastic, it's a bit of everything.
It's a bit of everything. And so, first of all, if you're implementing EPR, why do it only for plastics? You would recover the costs of dealing with the other materials as well. And but more importantly, there's stuff which EPR will be more it's more difficult to see how EPR alone funds certain infrastructure, like the management of the stuff isn't getting recycled. And of course, that's across all sorts of stuff, but also collection of organic wastes and separate collection of that and the management of that. There are really good and important reasons related to climate change impacts why we should be doing that, and why doing that as part of a well-designed system of waste management makes sense. And if we focus just on plastics when we're trying to develop a waste management system, not only do I think we'll do it very inefficiently, but if in some point in the future municipalities decide to do a really good job of stuff other than plastics, then you end up with systems sort of coming into conflict, and questions about, well, who owns what, who's invested in what will become important. But finally, there are just so many good reasons why you do this in the round to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to do it in an optimal manner. And look at where we are with plastics, but look at where we are with climate change. We've got to address both of these issues urgently. And until we do that, and we clearly aren't, if we've really got 2 point whatever it is billion people still without decent waste collection, then I can tell you we are not going to manage either plastics or to meet climate change objectives.
So what you're saying is we really need to look at the solution in a holistic manner, and address all the waste, because ultimately it's about bringing waste, convenient collection to all citizens, and they don't only generate plastics, so they have to have a system that they can use.
Exactly that, and we, in my view, would be foolish to do anything other than that.
That takes us to the end of our blogcast on these very important issues facing INC3 and also moving into INC4. Thank you very much, Dominic.
Thanks, Clarissa, and yeah, hope everyone manages to derive some sense from what we've been discussing. And good luck to all the delegates in Nairobi. It's a really important meeting.